Hello and welcome to CCIM Institute's webinar, COVID-19 Guidance, Navigating Rent Relief Requests and Other Commercial Real Estate Tenant Landlord Issues. Our panelists today include CCIM instructors Mark Seipert, CCIM, and Cynthia Shelton, CCIM. Joining them, we are thrilled to have Tori Goldson, partner at law firm Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner. Mark Seipert is a partner with Middleton Partners, a private equity investment firm specializing in creating value in quality properties through acquiring, developing, leasing, managing, and repositioning properties in targeted markets. Cynthia Shelton is Senior Managing Director of the Investments and Capital Markets Division at LandQuest Commercial out of Orlando, Florida. She specializes in the disposition of retail investment properties, including grocery-anchored, power shopping centers, single-tenant, net lease properties, and retail strip centers. And rounding out the panel is Tori Goldson. She's a partner with Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner. Her track record includes complex acquisitions, joint ventures, leasing and asset management projects, and real estate finance with respect to hotels, shopping centers, office complexes, and other real estate businesses. Thank you all for joining us today. So CCIM recently published a guide for rent relief requests and other commercial real estate tenant landlord issues online at ccim.com/rent relief. And it does a great job of covering this topic, but this is such a complex discussion that we're devoting today's 45-minute webinar to all of you out there to answer your questions on this important issue. So this particular webinar will not have a slide deck. It'll be completely dependent on the questions that we receive. So given that, please use the Q&A feature located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. We'll be answering as many as we can. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature, not the Q&A feature, but the chat feature so that we can properly help you with that. So let's dive in. It's apropos that we are hosting this webinar today, April 1st, not because it's April Fool's Day, but because it's a big day for the industry. According to a recent Wall Street Journal article, $81 billion in rent payments are due today in the US. Now, how many of them will actually be paid is the big question. And the even bigger question that we're here to address is what happens when the tenants are unable to pay the rent? And what does that look like upstream to the landlords and the lenders? Let me start by asking our panelists, though, what are the most common questions you're hearing about rent relief and other tenant landlord issues? Cynthia?
Sure. What I'm hearing right now is a little concern and major issues to do with can the tenants continue to pay. While I was waiting on this webinar, I just had a call from Macaroni Grill that some of you may know. And a lot of restaurants have had to close down. So how can they pay their rent? Which on the flip side of that from the tenant is the landlord. And how then can the landlord pay potentially their loan? And so it's a matter of now communicating, and we're going to be looking at some of that during this call.
That's great. Mark?
Yeah, to carry on with what Cynthia said, I think high level, everyone wants to know what impact this economic shock is ultimately going to have on my business. How long will it last, and how can I survive until then?
It's important questions. What about you, Tori? What are you hearing in the in that kind of legal area?
So on the legal front, we are hearing a lot of questions about what does rent relief look like? What kind of notices do I need to give as a landlord or a tenant to preserve my rights under a lease? From landlords, what do I need to do vis-a-vis my mortgage lender? Because landlords can't really engage in a rent relief program without being in partnership and having consents and approvals with their lenders. So it's really, I agree with the other panelists that we're really in that moment of where the only thing that's certain is that things are uncertain. And people are really trying to grapple with this. Is this just causing a cash flow issue for all these tenants, or is this really going to be a major overall business risk that we're living with for a long time? And so I think the difficulty in assessing rent relief policies and rent relief requests is that uncertainty. So I think people are focused right now on developing their process for making those requests, for receiving those requests, their authority, and, you know, more importantly, kind of looking to the governments and seeing where are we in the stimulus, where are we in the sheltering orders, to see what those impacts are. There's just a lot of unknowns right now that's preventing quick resolution.
It's fair. So while we're figuring out the government side, I think we could probably jump into some of just what could be available, the tenant, landlord, and lender at each level, what they could do right now, even without any of the government programs. So with a tenant, so I guess we'll go tenant and then move our way up the food chain, if you will, on this. What kind of concessions are available to tenants? How, you know, this is probably the first time some may have ever been in this situation. How exactly should they go about speaking with the landlord? What type of concessions should they be that are available right now that are always kind of evergreen, kind of continually available to tenants? What does that look like? And then kind of on the opposite side, the landlord side, how best is there something they could be doing proactively as well? Because they want to make sure that they have tenants at the end of this, right? Let's start with Cynthia. What are your thoughts on that as far as how should tenants be being proactive and what they can be expecting?
Well, when you say it the way you were just wording it, it's what they can expect or what they can do. It's all open. It depends on what their lease says, which I'm sure Tori could answer some of that. It depends on the tenant and have they been a good quality tenant for a while with the landlord. And if so, then I think it's called communication. I started that. It's communication with the landlord. It's the landlord with the tenant. It's with their lender. That's how I started. So I can tell you I'm already dealing with tenants. Our property management group is dealing with tenants that are saying we need help. The problem is you've got to narrow down what does that help mean? And in fact, is that free rent? Is it rent on the back side of the lease? What are they asking for as a tenant? Or what do they think they can expect to get as a tenant? But they've got to communicate and start talking about it. Otherwise, what are they going to do? And you mentioned close their doors. And that's a whole nother topic at the end of all this as to what we're going to have to deal with. But right now it's communicating. They could show their financials. They could say what kind of sales they are losing and a number of things that they could communicate with the landlord to be able to say, I need free rent. I'll extend my lease. I will pay you percentage rent, or maybe it's a loan. So there's a lot of different pieces, and a lot of that is on the resource page if you start looking through some of that.
That's great. Mark, what do you have anything to add on that front as far as some considerations that tenants should be keeping in mind when they're starting that conversation with their landlords?
I think Cynthia summarized it well. I would just emphasize be proactive in communicating. If you're a tenant, be proactive in communicating with your landlord, but also your customers, your suppliers. Get creative. These are troubling times, and everybody's in the same place. So, you know, one of the things that we're actively doing now is deferring rent and adding it onto the back end and extending lease terms. We've had several of those requests come in now. As far as rent forgiveness, you know, there's some easy give ups if you're a landlord. For example, if you have contract parking expenses, clearly that's not being used now. So to me, that's a short-term solution that could potentially help. But be proactive, communicate, and try to get as creative as possible, because everyone is having to deal with these problems together. It's not in isolation.
It's good advice. And there's actually a question that came through from one of our attendees right now for Tori. He mentions under many leases, a tenant being in default will take away certain future rights. such as first right of refusals, option to renew, etc., how can tenants avoid being in default with a rent relief request or agreement?
So thank you. So again, at BCLP, we represent landlords and tenants. So I'm going to give both perspectives here. But I think, and I think the problem is that under leases, your questioner is correct, that under leases, many rights that tenants have, and it's not just rights of first refusal, it's renewal rights, it's burn down rights on letters of credit, burn down rights on capped guarantees, it's exclusives, it's signage rights, it's the right to receive your allowance. Many of those things are, and in fact, if there are current abatements that are partial, many of those abatements can be conditioned upon you remaining in compliance with the lease and not going in default. Otherwise, you will lose that partial abatement that you might be in now. So the problem, of course, is that if you do go into default and you don't pay your rent and you don't cure it within the applicable cure period, if you have a cure period, your landlords will be able to take away those rights. And so part of any discussion with respect to rent relief from a tenant standpoint will be a desire to have a provision that allows the tenant to preserve those rights. And looking at it from the landlord side, obviously the landlords are going to want to encourage the tenants to do whatever they can to stay in compliance. In many instances, I doubt that the landlords are going to be motivated to hurt tenants that are hurting right now. I think there are reputational concerns that landlords have. Similar, there are concerns about what this really looks like over the long term for landlords. I don't think landlords or tenants should be 100% confident in their legal positions. Leases vary dramatically. I would say that when you look at most leases, many landlords have a stronger position that the tenant should pay rents. You'll see a lot out there that talks about force majeure, and I think you had some questions on force majeure coming in even before this panel began. And a lot of the knowledge that you see on force majeure, the articles and things, many of those doctrines are applicable to commercial contracts. And people forget that leases really are not the same thing as commercial contracts. Leases are their own animal. They're real estate, and they are a conveyance of real estate interests. Generally speaking, the covenants within leases are independent of one another. So the tenants, that's why you see a very common exception to even mutual force majeure clauses in leases is that tenants are nevertheless required to pay rent even when there are interruptions in their business. But that doesn't mean that the force majeure clause isn't going to be relevant in an attempt to avoid other negative impacts from failing to pay that rent, or other impacts to preserving rights, like an inability to give formal notice to preserve rights because FedEx won't deliver to a closed business. So it's not like these provisions are irrelevant in a lease. And again, some of the way that these provisions are written in leases can actually be different than what people are assuming. That's why force majeure provisions, along with many other lease provisions, it's important for tenants and landlords both to be reviewing those. But I would go back to Cynthia's point, which I think is an excellent one, that you have to remain in communication. Looking at it from both the landlord side and the tenant side, it's important to have an open line of communication. Both need to have a process to make quick decisions. Lenders right now are creating processes where they designate specific people for specific properties to have those people deal rapidly with rent relief requests coming from their borrowers for the benefit of their tenants. Landlords need to be working with lenders to make sure that that streamlined process is clear and they know what tenants need to provide. Tenants at a minimum are going to need to start gathering their financial information and making sure that they are able to show the impact of COVID-19 on their business, as well as what they think their business looks like on the back end. Can they show pent-up demand? Can they show a continuing viability that would encourage the landlord and the lender to invest with and help that tenant? I think we're seeing a lot more rent relief willingness from landlords. On the retail side, landlords want to keep, especially in office buildings with small amenities, landlords want to keep those retail tenants in a position to be able to come back when the orders lift and those retail operations are able to resume. On the retail side, obviously the impacts have been very tremendous, and so there are more rent relief opportunities there. Finally, I don't want to dominate this panel, but I will say 90 days seems to be sort of the popular period of time, the magic period that people are talking about. This may all stem from some guidance that the FDIC has given to lenders, in giving the idea to lenders that they really need to be working with their borrowers to perhaps modify loans through June 30. So again, that's that 90-day period. And so as a result, we have that effect of when the lenders start being able to offer things to their borrower landlords, the landlords then can figure out what they'll be allowed to do vis-a-vis the tenants. But everybody needs to make sure that they have point people for their organizations who are provided with the relevant information, who will be able to make decisions when on the phone. They're going to be hundreds and this is a workout situation. We've all seen this before a decade ago. Everyone has to get their team ready and they have to be able to make decisions on all sides quickly. This is not a situation where you're going to need to say, let me get back to you and consult with 500 cooks in my kitchen. You have to have people with authority so these decisions can be made quickly.
That's really great information. And I think perfect seg too, because you spoke about the landlord, and the landlord, it seems like the landlord is in a very unique position in this and not necessarily in the best way, right? Because they're in the middle. So they're having to work with their tenants, but also, as all of you have mentioned, it's so critical that the landlord is also working with their lenders. But on the landlord tenant side, what is your advice around that? You know, everything from jumping into the franchisor or franchisee type of model to even landlords who are facing renters in multifamily. What are the considerations there? What are they really legally allowed to ask financially, as far as you were saying, financial projections and those types of things, so that landlords are able to make the best decision they're able to on a case-by-case basis, of course, for rent relief or any other concessions that a tenant might be looking for. I guess, Cynthia, since I did mention franchisee, franchisor, we're in the retail sector. Do you want to take a crack at this first?
I'm trying to understand and comprehend what you're asking, but what, in short, are you saying, what can the landlords do to try to help?
Yes. What are their options? What can they be legally expected to ask of their tenants, as far as when they're trying to evaluate whether or not they're going to approve a rent relief request? They were also, is there anything unique around how franchisors and that franchisee regarding concessions on royalties, fees, et cetera?
Yeah, let me first of all tell you a couple of things, and both Mark and Tori have talked about, is the communication piece to the landlord and the tenant. One of the things as a landlord you would be asking the tenant, because some of the concerns are going to be, is this tenant, if they're franchised, do their franchisor have funds that they could help offset with? What does that franchise agreement say? So getting a copy of their franchise agreement, if possible, as part of your communication with them to look at giving them some help. The other side of that, Larry, is going to be, is what does the lease say to do with business interruption insurance? Is there some way to collect? And we've talked about that from the insurance company from loss of income. And there's a whole litany that would take us an hour or longer to go through just that one section. I can tell you, as a franchisee and franchisor, who's liable to the landlord? It depends on the lease at the end of the day and what the lease says along with that franchise agreement. And lastly, I will tell you, one of the things we're starting to ask for is sales. Show us your financials. Do they need help? And if they need help, one of the concerns are going to be, are they already underwater or barely making it? And will this put them under? And now you're going to work out free rent with them and you're going to owe. And in reality, you probably should go ahead and process all notices you need to per your lease, so that if something comes up and a hiccup happens, you're already trying to get through the process and it's known versus waiting.
It's good information. Mark, what would you add to that as far as, is there anything in particular on the office side or any other special considerations?
There's several things. Cynthia has a good list. I would also add to that, when you're communicating with your tenants, make sure that they've explored all options, some of which they may not be aware of. For example, the massive Coronavirus Aid Relief Economic Security Act, otherwise known as CARES, that was passed last week. This is, it's a huge amount of relief that's being provided in the form of, federally guaranteed loans to small businesses with fewer than 500 employees. Most of our tenants, many of our tenants would qualify. These are loans that could be up to 2.5 times their average monthly payroll, up to $10 million. And there is eligibility for loan forgiveness. This could infuse cash immediately to the tenants to help keep their business afloat. Ultimately, landlords have to determine, how much rent is coming in this month. Rent's due now. I think the bigger question is going forward in May, June timeframes. What type of cash flow disruption will there be to office investors? Can they continue to cover their operating costs, make their mortgage payments? Some proactive things that landlords can control is, but besides communicating with your tenants that we've already mentioned, you can adjust your building operations to reduce expenses. You could scale back things like your cleaning or parking attendant staffs. You can, you want to maintain your critical building maintenance items, but maybe hold off making discretionary capital investments. You want to preserve cash flows. Maybe you can stagger your work hours for your critical staff. You can adjust your HVAC run times to reduce your utility costs. There's some things you can do on the expense and capital control side that can help. But to reflect on what both Tori and Cynthia said, know your leases, communicate with your tenants. One thing I would add, and maybe Tori can weigh in on this, but when you're talking to your lenders, you want to do so in a way that avoids any potential loan recourse triggers. So you probably want to potentially consult with your attorney alongside talking to your lenders, and if all possible, make your April mortgage payments. Lenders are much more willing to have conversations with you if you're current on your loan.
Tori, this is perfect time if you want to jump in on this.
Yeah, and I think that is great advice from Mark. I do agree with everything that he just said. And I do think that, listen, when you call your lender is expecting your call. So, and so Mike, and the lenders are proactively, I think, reaching out to their borrowers as well. It is very important, I think, for tenants, landlords, lenders, for all of them to be consulting with their attorneys on their provisions. Because in many cases as well, to look at your insurance policies, all of these documents do have triggers. They have notice provisions, and they have things that landlords, tenants, lenders, insurance companies, things that everyone needs to do within particular timeframes. And so you have to proactively preserve your rights, because that's very important in this particular environment. I think one thing we haven't addressed that's probably on the minds of many of the people listening we've talked a little bit about stimulus, and there are some fabulous programs in there. And again, I think that's really about what other sources of funds are there out there for tenants to access. And you see many larger landlords, especially the retail landlords, including resource pages on their websites for tenants. This is all about helping the tenants find other sources of funds, or letting the tenants know, in essence, that there are these backstops for them furloughing employees so that they can use their cash to pay their rent and keep their location secure. But the one thing we also haven't talked about are sheltering orders, because there are things that a landlord cannot do right now in many jurisdictions. And there are things that affect tenants' businesses. There are orders that affect construction. And even beyond the sheltering orders, there are also decisions being made by courts to close their doors, which really, it's very different from some of the sheltering orders. So you may not have a sheltering order in your jurisdiction that says you cannot pursue a commercial or residential eviction, but you may in fact be unable to do that because the court in your applicable jurisdiction has closed its landlord-tenant courts. So landlords in particular really need to look closely at those orders. In the first instance, if they are thinking about taking action, they need to understand what they can and can't do, because just because you can't pursue an eviction doesn't mean that you can't get teed up and ready to pursue your eviction. But in some jurisdictions, they're not letting you get teed up. They're not letting you send out default notices. What does that mean for the accrual of late payments, late fees, and interest? So these are all questions landlords are going to have, and they're really going to be a case-by-case determination. Very similarly, tenants are going to be looking at the stay-at-home orders and figuring out what they can and can't do in terms of their businesses. Are they essential or are they not essential? We're seeing a lot of construction that's going on, but this is evolving every day. Even just within the last 48 hours, we've been seeing cities shut down the portions of their building departments that would issue COs. So while they may be letting certain construction go on, they're not going to be able to let landlords deliver those properties with a CO because they won't get that CO issued. And I think over time, you're seeing now too, some cities and governments waking up to the fact that maybe some of the construction going on isn't in connection with essential businesses. So I think you're going to see a lot of movement there. And this is just something that everyone has to pay attention to so they understand. I think landlords are going to want to keep their buildings open as much as possible, as much as they can within the confines of those orders. They're going to see those orders and characterize them in their own narratives as use restrictions. Tenants, on the other hand, will see those orders and characterize them as access restrictions. So I do think before landlords and tenants and lenders make decisions, it would be good for them to consult with their lawyers. I realize that's rather self-serving of me to say, being a lawyer, but it is important. This is a time where, you know, your legal rights do matter, and you do need to think about what you're doing so that you don't inadvertently waive those. And that you do what you can to preserve your rights, especially insurance. People need to be looking at their insurance policies right now and giving the requisite notices for coverage. And this is going to be looking at an insurance policy with lawyers too, because insurance brokers may not really have the best advice for you. So you need to get copies of your policies and look over those with your lawyers, because there are many ways in which different types of insurance policies might be able to help everyone.
It's good advice. And of course, the last piece of the puzzle is the lender perspective. What are you hearing around that? As far as lenders, what can they be expecting to offer? And what because some may not have gone through, how many pages was the relief package, Tori, you mentioned? It was
650.
For those who might not have done that light reading, would love to hear from the panel. What have you found in the new stimulus package that can directly help each of those specific audiences, tenants, landlords, and lenders? And whoever would like to jump in, maybe Tori, you can start because I know you've been hard at work trying to work through those pages.
Well, I'm the co-leader of the national leasing team at BCLP and the co-global leader of the corporate occupiers team. So we're a little bit more focused on the landlord tenant side, but I've definitely been, because I am on the COVID-19 response team for BLC, I have been actively involved in consulting with my colleagues about these things. I think the general consensus is that a lot of the stimulus package really provides kind of backstop programs to help the smaller tenants and individuals. So these things in turn help the larger companies with laying off people because there's that safety net of extending the employment benefits. And then of course the SBA loans that Mark mentioned are obviously of a big interest to some of, in particular, companies 500 or less employees. There's also some, and that program, the SBC has a great webpage on that really explains the process that small banks and other lenders are going to be setting up to implement that program. On the larger stimulus side of, which I think they call that Title IV of the stimulus package, there are big numbers and big programs. But the problem is, of course, the devil will be in the details there. A lot of agencies now are, scrambling to put together those programs and get the information out. So I think we'll be learning a lot more going forward. But I think right now, and I do see lenders and landlords focused on this, they are focused on getting the tenants hooked up with a lot of their local and federal resources through the stimulus package. I do think lenders are focused. There have been other laws rolling out over the past month, as well as directives from interagency directives from the FDIC, guidance being provided them, because we can't forget lenders are very focused on their regulatory obligations. They need to comply with laws. They need to be very careful in complying with laws. And so I think one difficulty probably for many lenders is going to be to make sure that they feel comfortable that what they're allowing their borrowers to do or want to allow their borrowers to do is going to be okay from a regulatory standpoint. For instance, everyone's looking for buckets of money. I mean, landlords have reserves for FF&E, for capital projects. Will lenders allow landlords to use those reserves for debt service now? If lenders are going to offer interest only, how long is it going to be? What are the payback terms? I think these are all things that there's going to need to be a tremendous amount of comfort on the regulatory side for lenders in order for them to roll out these programs. So in that period of delay, I think people are going to be focused on getting tenants help so that maybe tenants will be able to pay some of that rent. But it all remains to be seen. Today is a big day, being April 1st. It really remains to be seen as to how much rent is going to be received by landlords across the country. And I think that will really, it's already an urgent situation, but I do think that the numbers as they start rolling out and the reporting there are going to drive the urgency of those conversations. So
it's true. Yeah, that is going to be very telling. Mark, you had mentioned some of the government programs, the new government programs that are available out there, and the importance of landlords helping their tenants out. Can you talk more about what you're doing specifically, or have you seen some others doing that are really knocking it out of the park around that, and flesh out some of those programs look like to help tenants out?
We're so early into this that, and the program is so broad, it's hard to specifically pinpoint every item in the Relief Act. I would just say, from a macro standpoint, the government seems to be doing, this is the largest relief package in the history of the United States in terms of dollars. And the government is doing everything they can to stimulate economic activity, from cutting rates effectively to federal funds rate effectively to zero, to flooding the market with liquidity, to making sure that our Federal Reserve and our financial system does not seize up. This is a much different shock to the system than the Great Recession was back in 2008. We went into this much healthier, and the shock has come on much more quickly. So there are specific programs out there, Larry, related to what could help tenants. But I think the best advice would make sure when you're talking to your tenants, if you're a landlord investor, make sure they have access to the information to get answers to their specific questions. I don't know that anyone is an expert on this. It's moved so quickly, but you can certainly direct them to sources that can offer help. And there are many out there, and perhaps we could start posting those on our CCIM resources page.
Yeah.
Yes,
This is Tori. That's the Paycheck Protection Program that we were talking about. I just wanted to make that clear. And it's on the SBA's website. They have a great page on the Paycheck Protection Program. And that's the one that Mark had mentioned with some forgivable aspects to those potential loans. And so that is a program that I think many smaller tenants and companies are going to be shooting for. Whether that program can apply to SPE LLCs and other things, I think people will be calling their attorneys to ask those questions and to really dig into those details, because as with many laws, especially when they get rolled out quickly, lawmakers don't necessarily think of all of the scenarios that can occur. And so there's going to be a lot of need for quick guidance from the various governmental authorities to the lenders implementing programs and things like that on these qualifications. But it really remains to be seen. But I do think right now people are going to be looking very closely at whether they qualify, in particular for that Paycheck Protection Program.
Yes, and we've posted, just to let all of our listeners know too, we do have a go-to page, ccim.com/COVID-19, that does cover a lot of the new stimulus bill, and we are trying to get as many details out there as they become available, all the different particulars on how to, the nuts and bolts of it, to help everyone that's listening today. So please make sure that you check that out. Now, switching gears, we talked about federal government. There's also the state government, right, that's adding an interesting wrinkle. And I want to address that across the board here. State of California has imposed a moratorium on evictions. And the question is assumed that it's intended for residential tenants at this time. However, are you aware of movements of this nature towards commercial tenants? And that brings up the bigger picture, right, of I might be in a market right now that doesn't have, my state government has not made any restrictions that could impact me, meaning a moratorium on evictions or mortgage abatements or anything like that. How can I, as a lender, landlord, how can I get ahead of that so that if the state government comes in, that I'm positioning myself in the right place to handle something like that when it's forced on me, versus we've been talking about negotiations and having this communication. What happens when it's forced on you because of state government, and how can people get ahead of that? It's a big question, I know, and it came through. So thoughts, let's start with the legal side. What does that mean legally for, say, a landlord or a lender?
So one thing is that there are orders out there in place that do actually restrict even commercial evictions. And there are, like I said, decisions that have been made by courts at the trial court level to shut down their landlord tenant courts, which has the practical effect of stymieing those efforts. It can. This varies dramatically from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it is changing. There are things legally speaking, and people should consult their lawyers, but there are things legally that you need to do to tee up an eviction. So many times you do need to give notices and things like that. Now, whether you want to do that in this particular environment is another issue. Whether you might seriously think about working out the situation short of eviction. There is definitely I do not think we are seeing the end of orders to stay evictions. And so even if you're able to file right now because you don't have, a stay on those types of processes, will your case be stayed? Will you be able to continue going forward if there is an order? Those things just aren't known. I do think that it is best if parties can work out their differences. We also don't know, and I don't think we've talked about this yet, but the sheltering orders, the holds on evictions, this is what we're seeing now. But we may see some more in the future, even with mandated rent relief. I believe that the New York State Senate right now is discussing rent relief being
Yes.
required for small commercial tenants and residential tenants. This is obviously would be a great concern, I think, for landlords and their lenders. And so this is something that one will have to monitor closely. And I think the government, the public and things like that, they definitely are looking to see if landlords, tenants, lenders, insurers, if everyone can get along and equitably allocate these risks and solve these situations amongst themselves. Not every situation is going to work out, but parties definitely do need to think about that. That doesn't mean that all these orders, by the way, would be legal. That's another question to ask your lawyers and to think about, if you have a very difficult situation. So in any event, I guess I hate to use this word, but everybody's using this word. It's very fluid. It is changing every day. And so it is very difficult to plan your next move. But I think as we're getting close to doing this, that kind of segues for me into my closing remark, because my closing remarks were really that it is in the best interest of all these stakeholders. And there are many in the landlord-tenant situation. It's not just the landlord-tenant as we've talked about. It is in their best interest to try and work through these. No one should be overly confident of their legal position, because depending upon the duration of these COVID-19 impacts and the impacts of the illnesses of individuals, and I do hope everyone on this call is safe and that their loved ones are safe, these things will continue to exacerbate the magnitude of those impacts, and that will exacerbate and make it more difficult to allocate those risks. But when those dollars get large enough and parties end up in court, or they end up in arbitration, or the public and the lawmakers end up involved, it's very hard to know what will happen with risk allocation and what kind of intervention we're going to see and what judges and decision makers will do. And I would say that oftentimes in situations like this, although we don't really have a pandemic situation like this, but courts, decision makers, folks generally fall back on basic equitable principles and human instinct to allocate risk in a fair manner. And that can become kind of subjective. And it really causes decision makers to look at stakeholders from a Hollywood way of, are you a good guy or are you a bad guy? Are you keeping, as Cynthia said, the lines of communication open? Are you keeping, as Mark said, being helpful to tenants, doing what you can to make sure that you have tenants at the end of the day in your assets? Those types of things. If you are sensitive to those types of things, that's, I think, going to end the day be a good thing. It doesn't mean you should give up your strong legal position. It doesn't mean that you should compromise at every, turn and panic. But it means that you should probably look at your conduct through the lens of, am I being fair? Am I being reasonable and humane under the circumstances? And I think if you can do that, so that the narrative that you create with your letters, your conduct, your website shows that you are a team player, doesn't mean you're waiving your legal rights or giving tenants, if you're a landlord, everything they want or vice versa. But it will mean, I think, then that you will not be one of the bad guys in the very rudimentary back of the napkin equitable assessment that this might all come down to. So that's my closing remark. Don't panic, stay positive, things may look grim now, but we're strong and we've been through rough stuff. And so I think landlords, tenants, everyone will adapt, they'll emerge stronger, and we just stay positive, stay positive.
Great. That's wonderful. Cynthia, what would you like to close with? There's so much we've covered. What would be your closing piece of advice or closing thoughts?
Add to something Tori said. My closing advice would be something my friend Casey Conway has said recently on several things. Look up and look forward. We've made it through several things in the real estate industry, from interest rates hitting 18% in the 80s to the 9/11 attacks to the 08 issue with the banks. And now we're into this. We can get through this. We have to look up and look forward and find solutions. Some of those solutions, as Mark has mentioned and Tori, are things that are called communications with your tenants, your landlords, your lenders. And as agents or owners or whatever position you're in, I can tell you that I have been told by every attorney we're dealing with on several of these, at least place the notice of default, even if you have to call them and say, I'm doing this because the lease mandates it, but I want to work it out with you, and then put that in writing. Show that you're a good guy, but you also are following the rules and following the current laws, whatever they are. And stay on top by attending seminars like this one and others. I'm getting probably 10 a day, it seems like, either articles or invites to a webinar, and I've attended several just to try to stay on top of it, to be able to help myself and my clients. So I would encourage you to communicate, reach out, and know that we're all in this together. And as Casey says, look up and look forward.
Great advice. Mark?
Yeah, to wrap up, these are unprecedented times. Our business has been impacted greatly. Leasing and investment activity effectively have halted. The last week there were almost 3.5 million new jobless unemployment claims, and that's from a 50-year record low unemployment prior to that. I've seen where economists at the Fed have projected near-term unemployment as high as 30%. These are really uncertain times. Everybody's feeling it, but I've been following market cycles for a long time. That's what I teach in CCIM. And what I do know is that every time U.S. has bounced back, we're a very large, resilient, diverse economy. We will recover from this. And the question is timing, but I really believe that we're going to come out of this with a substantial amount of pent-up demand, a very strong, hopefully very quick recovery, and we will get through it. So I want to leave on that positive note that yes, we're in the troubling times right now. We've been through it before. We will get through this as well, and we're going to come back stronger than ever.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Cynthia and Tori, for this fantastic discussion. It seems like we've just started the conversation and made some good headway, but there's still so much more to come as the days and weeks and months unfold around this. For everyone out there, thank you for joining us today. Go ahead and bookmark our go-to online resource page for coronavirus resources and guidance for commercial real estate professionals. That's ccim.com/COVID-19. CCIM Institute is updating this page regularly to provide the latest insights and practical tools to help you weather the storm, including updates on this topic. So please check back regularly. We are also pushing information out through our social networks, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. In addition, a recording of today's presentation will be made available to attendees within about 48 hours, and it'll also be available on the rent relief page at ccm.com, so you can share that with your colleagues or on social media. And because we are live streaming on YouTube, it is available immediately on YouTube, so you can certainly share that with those that may not have been able to join us today. But thank you to everyone who has joined us today, and I hope everyone takes care and that we will all get through this together as a community. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.